Every crisis, even when it does not lead to the immediate collapse of a system, leaves behind something far more durable than temporary price swings or changes in tanker routes. It changes the way the participants in that system think. It changes their perception of risk, their readiness to act, their definition of what is stable and what merely appears to be stable. And it is precisely in that sense that the events surrounding Khark in the year 2026 do not end when direct tensions begin to recede. They pass into a new phase, a phase in which the world tries to understand what, in fact, has happened, and what the longer-term consequences are likely to be. Khark, which for decades stood as a symbol of efficiency and concentration, begins to be seen differently. Not as an advantage, but as a risk. As an example of how deeply an entire system can become dependent on a single point, and how quickly that dependence can turn into weakness in a moment of crisis. This leads to a fundamental shift in the way energy infrastructure is understood, not only in Iran, but in other states as well. In Tehran, a process of reflection begins. It is not publicly announced as a strategic shift. It is visible instead through action. Those actions suggest an attempt at diversification, an attempt to build greater redundancy, an attempt to reduce dependence on a single terminal. Yet this is neither a rapid process nor an easy one. Infrastructure on this scale is not built in a short time. Its construction requires resources. It requires stability. And under conditions of tension, stability is often precisely what is lacking. At the same time, for the United States and its allies, these events become evidence of the effectiveness of a strategy of limited pressure, a strategy that does not rely on full-scale conflict, but on focused actions capable of producing systemic effects. This encourages the further development of instruments that make it possible to influence an adversary without formally crossing the threshold of war. Such a logic becomes increasingly attractive, because it is cheaper, harder to attribute, and politically easier to defend. Modern conflicts are taking on hybrid forms with growing frequency. At their center stands critical infrastructure. It becomes both a target and an instrument of influence. That means the case of Khark may become a model that is analyzed and perhaps applied in other regions of the world as well, not as an exceptional anomaly, but as a preview of a new operational norm. At the global level, these events accelerate processes that were already visible before: diversification of energy sources, development of alternative technologies, expansion of strategic reserves. This shows that crisis does not create entirely new trends. It strengthens the ones that already existed. It gives them greater momentum, greater significance, greater urgency. Financial markets, which reacted immediately to the events around Khark, begin to stabilize. But that stabilization now carries a different character than before. It contains a new level of risk premium, a new assessment of what may happen and how quickly it may affect the system as a whole. That means that even in periods of relative calm, tension does not disappear. It remains present, though less visible. It is embedded in price, in calculation, in the institutional memory of markets and investors. At the same time, energy importing states begin to treat security of supply as an element of national strategy with even greater importance than before. This leads to decisions that only a few years earlier might have been regarded as too costly, too radical, too excessive. In the new reality, they begin to appear justified and at times even necessary. It is often after a crisis that ideas once dismissed as overreaction suddenly become common sense. Khark, once merely one component among many, becomes a symbol of systemic fragility, an example of how deeply the world depends on infrastructure that can be disrupted, and how quickly that disruption can translate into consequences on a global scale. That is why its significance extends beyond the island itself. It becomes part of a broader narrative about security, risk, and dependence, about the illusion of stability that lasts only until the first serious test. At the same time, a question emerges for which there is no simple answer. Is the world moving toward a new equilibrium, one in which similar events become less frequent because the system itself becomes more resilient? Or is it moving toward greater instability, in which critical infrastructure will be used more and more often as a tool of pressure, while the boundaries between peace and conflict continue to blur? That question remains open, and perhaps that is precisely what best captures the nature of the age in which we live. The long-term consequences of disruption in the energy sector are not confined to shifts in prices or trade flows. They can affect growth, inflation, social stability. That means events such as those surrounding Khark carry consequences that extend far beyond the energy sector itself. In reality, they touch almost the entire economic structure, from the macroeconomic level to the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. As a result, the world after Khark is no longer the same as it was before, even if many elements of the system remained physically in place. What changes is the way those elements are perceived, managed, protected. That is why a crisis that may have seemed episodic becomes a reference point for future decisions, future strategies, and a new language of security. And that is precisely why this episode, though it is the last, is not the ending of the story. It is its open finale, the moment when all previous events arrange themselves into the image of a world standing before a choice. Will it use the lessons of crisis to build a more resilient system? Or will it remain trapped in the logic of tension, in which every new impulse can trigger another wave of change? That is why Khark ceases to be merely an island. It becomes a symbol of the era in which we live. There are places that exist on maps as points, coordinates, names written in atlases and reports, and yet over time, they cease to be merely geographical realities. They begin to function as symbols, as shorthand for processes too complex to be captured in a single sentence, and that is exactly the path Khark has taken. An island that began as a logistical point for loading oil has become one of the most suggestive images of contemporary geopolitics, a mirror reflecting the way the world works, its dependencies, its tensions, and its uncertainty. Its history, set out in successive acts, is not in truth the history of one island alone. It is the history of a system that made the island into something more than infrastructure. Khark did not create its own role. The world assigned that role to it. The world needed a place at which the flows of energy, finance, and politics could intersect at one point. In that way, a node emerged of such importance that its very existence began to influence decisions taken far beyond its own boundaries. One motif returns throughout this story, like a refrain: the motif of concentration and its consequences. Khark is proof that efficiency and risk are often two sides of the same coin. A system seeking to optimize its own functioning tends toward concentration of resources, toward shorter routes, toward lower costs. But in doing so, it also creates points whose significance rises to such a level that they become both the foundation of the system and a potential threat to it. It was precisely that logic that led Iran, rather than building a dispersed network of terminals, to concentrate its exports in one place. It created a system that was efficient, but at the same time highly vulnerable to disruption. In periods of stability, that appeared rational. In moments of crisis, it proved to be a decision whose consequences reached far beyond the purely economic sphere. At the same time, Khark shows that infrastructure is not neutral. It is not merely a tool, it is part of the game. In that game, every pipeline, every storage tank, every terminal becomes part of a larger puzzle. Economy and politics intertwine here so deeply that separating them becomes almost impossible. Decisions taken in one sphere are reflected immediately in the other. Energy security now belongs among the key elements of global stability. That means infrastructure, such as Khark, cannot be considered only in technical terms. It must be analyzed as part of a system that includes politics, economy, and security. Only then does its full significance become visible, and only then does the scale of the consequences produced by its disruption become fully clear. In that sense, the island becomes not only a place, it becomes a process a dynamic element of a changing world, changing together with it. It responds to global tensions. It reflects the direction in which the world is moving. And at the same time, it influences the way that direction takes shape. That is why its story has no single ending. It is a sequence of events flowing into one another, never stopping entirely, only changing form. When we look at Khark through the prism of the conflict of 2026, we see more than a series of incidents. We see the moment at which theory meets practice, the moment at which scenarios analyzed for years begin to materialize, and the moment at which a system that appeared stable reveals its sensitivity to impulses that had once seemed merely hypothetical. It is in such moments that the true nature of the contemporary world becomes visible, its ability to adapt, but also its vulnerability to disruption, its tendency to balance on the edge between stability and instability. That is what makes every crisis both a test and a lesson, a question about whether the system is capable of changing, or whether, after a short shock, it will simply return to familiar patterns. Khark plays a special role within that narrative. It is the point at which those processes become almost physically visible. It is here that political decisions translate into the movement of tankers. It is here that international tensions shape the rhythm of work at the terminal. It is here that global markets respond to events unfolding on a relatively small island. At the same time, its history shows that the world in which we live is a world of connections, dependencies, and feedback loops. One place can affect many others. A local incident can have global consequences. And that is precisely why the analysis of points such as Khark becomes the key to understanding broader processes. At times, one island tells us more about the world than dozens of grand political declarations. This is not, however, a simple story. Nor is it a finished one. Every act that makes up this narrative opens further questions about the future of the energy system, the role of critical infrastructure, the limits of conflict, and the possibility of maintaining stability in a world that grows ever more complex and ever more interconnected. In that context, Khark remains both a symbol and a warning. It reminds us that efficiency has its price, that concentration carries risk, and that the stability we often treat as self-evident is in reality the result of a continuous play of forces, decisions, and dependencies. And all of that can change faster than we are able to predict. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this entire story. The world is not a collection of separate elements. It is a system in which everything is connected. To understand a single point, such as Khark, is to begin to see the mechanisms that shape the whole. That is why the island, though small on the map, becomes one of the most important places from which to observe how the contemporary world actually functions. Because Khark is not only an island, it is a question about how long a system can continue to function under tension, how much it can change before it crosses a line, and whether the world that created such places is capable of finding a way to protect them, not only from physical destruction, but also from the consequences of decisions taken far beyond their shores. And the answer to that question, though still unknown, will determine not only the future of the island itself, it will also determine the future of the system of which it forms a part. At the end of this story, a few additional things are worth saying, not in order to change the meaning of the whole narrative, but rather to illuminate its background more clearly. Khark is one of those places that appears small only when one looks at it on a map. When viewed through the prism of flows of oil, money, and strategic decision-making, it becomes clear that this island carries far greater weight than its size would ever suggest. The first point concerns geography itself. Khark lies relatively close to the Iranian coast, yet its importance does not arise from proximity to land, but from its position within the wider export system. It is not simply an island near a shoreline. It is the end point of an enormous organism, the point at which the entire land-based effort of the state is transformed into export. One could say that for Iranian oil, Iran begins deep within the country, but it ends precisely there, at Khark, It is there that crude ceases to be a resource underground and becomes part of global circulation. The second point concerns Iranian oil itself. In public debate, it is often spoken of as though it were merely a political problem or a bargaining chip in a dispute with the West. Yet for Iran itself, oil was for decades not just one sector of the economy. It was a mechanism of statehood. Export revenues were not used only to multiply profit. They sustained the state's ability to function. They financed the administration, subsidies, imports, currency stability, at times even social calm. That is why, in Iran's case, oil is not merely a commodity, it is part of the architecture of power. It is also worth remembering that the Iranian economy spent years learning how to function under pressure. That means the oil-based system was not only earning, it was also adapting, learning how to bypass restrictions, learning how to operate semi-officially, and at times in shadow form. In that sense, the Iranian oil sector is not only an example of dependence on a raw material, it is also an example of political and logistical resilience. Even if that resilience is costly, even if it functions less effectively than it would under full normality, it still exists. And that is precisely why Khark has remained in the game for so long. The third point concerns the Strait of Hormuz itself. It is one of those places almost everyone has heard of, yet few truly understand how its significance operates. Hormuz is not important because it is famous. It is famous because it is important. It is a choke point, a narrow passage through which an enormous share of global oil and liquefied natural gas trade moves. Looking at a map, one may think it is merely a strait between two masses of land. In reality, it is a place where local geography imposes conditions on the global economy, and that is why every crisis around Iran almost automatically becomes a crisis around Hormuz. Khark and Hormuz are tied together more deeply than it may first appear. Khark is the point of departure. Hormuz is the gate. One without the other does not make a complete system. Even the most efficient export terminal has little meaning if the cargo cannot safely move onward. By the same logic, the strait itself would not be so strategic if it were not fed by such immense volumes of raw material from the region. That is why tensions surrounding these places so often overlap. One reinforces the significance of the other. There is also a more symbolic curiosity here. Over the years, Khark has become something like a test for each historical era. During the revolution, it showed whether the new Vlasti could take control of the state together with its economic bloodstream. During the war with Iraq, it showed whether Iran could preserve revenue despite bombardment. In the era of sanctions, it showed whether the system could survive in the shadows. During the crisis of 2026, it showed how thin the line really is between analysis and an actual disturbance of global equilibrium. That is why the island's history is, in a certain sense, the history of repeated tests of the state's resilience. It is also worth pausing over the tankers themselves. For most people, they are simply very large ships. In this story, however, they are something more. They are the moving extension of the infrastructure itself. It is they that carry away from Khark not only oil, but also the island's political significance. Every such ship is simultaneously cargo, contract, risk, calculation, and signal to the market. When tankers move normally, the world treats it as routine. When they change course, disappear from monitoring systems, or wait before entering the terminal, that routine is instantly transformed into geopolitics. There is one more point that matters. In the case of Khark, one sees very clearly that the contemporary world no longer needs grand spectacles in order to enter a state of crisis. Sometimes a few incidents are enough, a few route changes, a few hours of uncertainty, a few nervous market reactions. This shows that modern infrastructure operates within a logic of extreme sensitivity. The system does not have to be destroyed in order for the effects of danger to be felt. It is enough that it ceases to be regarded as entirely predictable, and that leads to a final observation. Khark is important not only because oil passes through it, it is important because the world has come to believe in its importance. And when markets, states, militaries, and institutions begin to treat a point as critical, its real significance grows still further. In that sense, the island is not only a physical object, it is also a construction of strategic imagination, a place existing simultaneously in geography and in the minds of decision-makers. And at times, it is that second layer that proves even more important. That is why, when the story of Khark seems to end, nothing in truth is ending at all. What remains is simply a deeper understanding. The understanding that somewhere in the Persian Gulf there exists a small island capable of saying more about the contemporary world than many a summit, conference, or speech. Because at Khark, everything becomes clearer. Dependence on energy, the fragility of stability, the power of infrastructure, and the price paid for a world built upon concentration.